again, just to reiterate, the format for this course is that I am just doing weekly lessons, and Matt will meet you in the greenhouse during the week to do various bits of crop work. So, by all means, Matt often has something to share. If you got questions, ask him. If he can't answer them, ask me. If I can't answer them, I'll just find the answer. So, um, this is a link that obviously only works in the PowerPoint version of the lesson in the folder, but it just takes you to some statistics on greenhouses. It might be worth looking at. You can see sales volumes for different types of crops that are grown. I've pulled some numbers from that for this presentation just to take a look at some of the things that are going on. Poinsettia sales have been declining over the last number of years. I think it's actually stabilized. I should really update this. It's pretty stable up to 2020, maybe a modest increase last year, but more or less stabilized. And Ontario seems to be following the national trend, although we grow the vast majority. Total potted plants. So this is not just poinsettias. This is everything. Your gerbers, your cyclamen, whatever, calanchos. Up to 2016, looks like things have been fairly stable around the 200 million plus pots count, maybe 210, 215 million around there. Since 2011, there's a couple of bad years in there, but so I was looking at that. Okay, so potted sales have remained relatively stable, let's say. Comparing that to other crops like tropicals, they have seen more or less a steady increase in sales. And that has actually increased to present day sales as well. Whereas poinsettias have declined in sales. And I think what we're looking at is more a shift in demographics. An older population that is more interested in poinsettias is disappearing, and a younger generation that's more interested in long-term tropical plants that improve the quality of their life and whatnot. Those sales are slowly increasing. You just have to go to IKEA and you see that the tropical plant section in there has grown substantially over the last few years. And grocery stores still sell tropical plants and whatnot, but poinsettias have declined. I think they've somewhat stabilized. A lot of growers that used to grow don't grow them anymore, but there's still a number that consistently produce that crop. It is it fits well into the rotation of a lot of ornamental greenhouses because let's say your lion's shares of your sales are Mother's Day or garden center sales. What do you do with your summer fall sales, right? So there's outdoor fall mums and there's poinsettias that will bring your cash flow in with the fall mums and then cash flow in with Christmas. And then once Christmas is done, you start planting your annual garden center stuff. Some of your Mother's Day stuff you'd have to plant before the poinsettias, but you can space them out as soon as the poinsettias are gone. Keep in mind, poinsettias mostly are shipped out of the greenhouse well before the second week of December. So they have time to grow and expand their Mother's Day crops right after that. So obviously businesses are trying to keep the cash flowing so they keep their employees employed full-time year-round. Poinsettias are part of the Euphorbia family, Euphorbiaceae. They are mostly derived of succulents and cacti. So you may not have thought about that. The poinsettia is a bit of an odd bird in that family, but they are related. They grow in a lot of different habitats. They are definitely a latex producing plant. If you ever see a branch snap, they produce that white sap that euphorbias are known for. Specifically is Euphorbia pulcherrima, and like a lot of how these plants were originally discovered and brought to the Western world, it was through sort of wealthy travelers. In this case, an American ambassador brought back something that he called Christmas Star from Mexico. And these plants have been grown in Mexico all the way into the Aztec territories for centuries. It is a winter flowering shrub in those more tropical climates, but is not frost tolerant. This is just a quick photo collage of euphorbia plants. And you can see there's a great variety of plant structure in there, but a lot of the sort of recognizable cacti would be in there. Another euphorbia commonly seen in stores these days is this thing, I think it's called the crown of thorns plant. Obviously, lots of thorns here, nasty looking thing. Um, this is a photograph of sort of a native climate where poinsettias would have grown. Hilly, mountainous parts of Mexico, and it grows sometimes planted in near houses or just growing along fence rows. It's seen everywhere on this side as well. Um, Poinsettias are a little interesting and deviate from a lot of the flowering plants that we're familiar with in that their flower structure is very different. So they have what are called bracts and cyathea. Um, the colored leaves that make up the poinsettia that we know, so I should use yellow, those are called the bracts. And they're actually an accessory structure. And the flowers are in the center, these little bits here. Those are called cyathea. Um, so the cyathea are not particularly attractive. They're not sold for that. They're sold for the bracts. An important, really important thing to note is that bracts are modified leaves, but they do not have stomata. Now, that'll be important to remember for later on when we talk about some of the physiological challenges with growing poinsettias. So no stomatas means there's no pores that open and close in the bract. Okay, so moisture can't exit the leaf. Gases are not exchanged. Oops, let me erase that. So keep that in mind. So bracts are modified leaves with no stomata. Uh, Looking closer at a cyathea, you'll see that poinsettias are actually monoecious, which means they have both uh, female and male flowers. Sorry, my X's are hard to see in this. Got to pick better contrasting colors. So the ovary here represents the female part of the flower with the styles. This is where the pollen has to land. And the male flowers over here with the anthers and the pollen will self-fertilize the female part. So very unusual flower structure in the way just looking at it, you can see it's not symmetrical. There's also a nectar gland, which looks really weird. If you look from another angle, you can see the nectar glands that open up. You can see some of the nectar in this area. These nectar glands are the reward for pollinators, right? So they come to the flower, they're rewarded with some sugar or nectar, and in the process they step on the pollen and transfer it to the styles and fertilize the poinsettias. Um, a lot of times we look at the development of the flowers to give an idea of the age of the plant and its shelf life. As the nectaries are still very visible and the male flowers have not presented their stamen much, this flower is fairly young and has a good shelf life. Once the female flower is really extended and the stamen are well exposed, then we're near the end of the shelf life and the bracts will start to fall off. This shows sort of the alternate development that we see in how poinsettia grows with the terminal inflorescence of the cyathea. So poinsettias are a short day flowering crop, just like fall mums. So that means that they naturally start to flower as the days shorten. Um, if we don't want them to flower, we have to have continuous long nights. So continuous long nights, either with leaving grow lights on or, I'm sorry, blackout. I was getting ahead of myself. Blackout curtains might be needed. Uh, or we can use photoperiod induction, where we turn lights on in the middle of the night a little bit to break up the night. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Um, Temperature, a little later, sorry. Temperature also is a big factor with poinsettias. Photoperiod plays a role, for sure, but temperature is actually almost as influential with poinsettias. And when you think about it, as the season changes, as fall changes, we're looking at equinox around September 22nd. We're not there yet, but already you notice a change in the climate. It's cooler during the day, the night times are cooler. Our average daily temperature has decreased. And so for plants that have evolved on the planet, that's what they're looking at is the whole picture, not just one thing. So yes, photoperiod plays a role, and as does temperature. So delaying flower can be done using night interruption. So if remember from Plant Science 1, if you take a long night and we put a light on in the middle of the night, we break that long night up into two short nights. So the plant thinks that it's a short night and it won't flower in the case of poinsettias. So in this photograph, there's some bulbs hanging in a string in the greenhouse. And they come on in the middle of the night for maybe 15, 20 minutes. You don't need a lot of light. It's just a little bit of red light emanating from the bulb that's going to hit the plants and reset their sensory system. Don't want to get into the details of it, but phytochrome, if you really want to know. But that brief nighttime interruption is enough to keep the poinsettias from flowering. Now, you may want to do that if you're having a late crop, or you want to extend the size of the crop so it's a bit bigger before it flowers. Other things that influence flower development, propagation. So if you start early or late, depending on when you're going to sell your crop, right? That is ultimately what it's all about. Some crops are pre-sold and there's ship dates that you have to stick to. So depending on whether you're shipping early or late, you may use blackout or you might just let the plants flower naturally. So for example, if you use blackout to extend the night earlier in the season, your poinsettias will flower sooner, which means you can sell them sooner. If you just let the poinsettias flower naturally, then they'll flower later. And all things being what they are, most companies these days are impatient. Most consumers, I guess you could say, are impatient, and they want everything sooner. Um, like, Halloween stuff is probably already in the stores, and we're nowhere near Halloween. And the second Halloween's over, they're going to have Christmas stuff in the stores, boom, right away. So along with that comes earlier poinsettia sales. So it's important to have the ability to black out your crop so you can extend the night earlier to get that additional time to get them to flower sooner. Um, Again, as far as temperature, that plays a role in flower development and keeping the average daily temperature below 20, 21 degrees Celsius because it's a cooler crop is important. So that daily average temperature is where you take your day temperature and your night temperature and then you add them together and divide by 2. And we want to keep that for sure below 24 degrees in order for the bracts to become big. If it's too hot, they'll flower, but they'll be small bracts. And of course, we don't really want a crop that has small bracts. Um, Propagating. So 2 to 3 mature sized leaves, if you think about it, that's pretty big cutting. So poinsettia cuttings tend to be on the large size. 5 to 7 centimeters on the stem, sometimes even longer if you're direct sticking into the final pot, which not everyone does. Some farms do. Those that do their own propagation often will direct stick into their own pot. Those that do a lot of propagating often will sell some of their own cuttings to other farms and then use their own. So they may grow in plugs. So they'll use the smaller 5 to 7 centimeter cuttings, which is still fairly large. That's sort of a typical cutting that you might see. And then, of course, there's rooting compound applied to the bottom part of the stem, which is just auxin hormone, right? So as far as rooting, misting is absolutely critical for the first 2 to 4 days, uh, sorry, first couple of days. And the main reason, obviously, is because these are large cuttings, they have large leaves. And with large leaves, they have lots of stomata, which means there's a lot of opportunity for moisture to evaporate out of the leaves, which would cause water stress in the stem. And if at the very end where you've cut the cutting, there's water stress, that will die. And if that dies, it can rot, and then you don't get root formation. So misting is often really just to regulate transpiration so that the cutting doesn't dry out. and water is not pulled away from that cutting that you just made on the fresh edge. Um, Light levels fairly low when propagating. 150 watts per square meter is on the low side. Um, and then again, air movement is kept to a minimum. Uh, Again, that's to do with drying out, right? You don't want to have fans blasting away on your propagation table. You're trying to maintain a fairly high humidity environment. Obviously, the idea is root your stuff as quickly as possible and get them out of that environment into a better environment. Otherwise, you start getting disease. And once again, same thing applies right from the start. Your day-night temperature, your average daily average temperature should not be more than 24 degrees Celsius, which if it's a warm fall can be very difficult to do. So some greenhouses will struggle with that. Obviously, misting helps cool because of evaporative cooling. So if it's a drier fall like this fall, then that can work well too. Rooting compound, definitely beneficial. Some cuttings don't benefit from rooting compound. Some actually rot if you put rooting compound out, but generally speaking, it's beneficial. So you're looking at a typical, like a healthy cutting taken from a healthy growing plant will start to form callus within a week. And then you'll start to see roots well into the second half of the week that they're on the bench. Um, as far as fertilization goes, this is kind of a common theme here. Um, you're going to start fertilizing anywhere from 50 to 100 once the roots appear, so well into your second week. One of the reasons is we do this is if you fertilize early in a crop, you spoil it and it doesn't motivate it to grow roots as quickly. And then you end up being on the propagation bench too long and you run the risk of disease. So by just exposing the plants to just raw water for the first week or so, they're quickly going to look for nutrients and root into their rooting media, and you'll get better, more sound rooting happening. Uh, Applying early in the morning is fine, but the key here is running, oh, my eraser, is clear water after, running clear water after, because otherwise the salts will burn the leaves. Poinsettia leaves are fairly delicate, and the fertilizer can, as it hangs on the edge of the leaf, can cause salt burn. As far as media, the kind of soil you're going to grow poinsettias in, they like excellent drainage. Now, almost every crop says and good drainage, but there's some crops where it's a lot higher, like definitely more drainage. For example, our strawberry crop in the greenhouse requires really high levels of perlite, almost 50-50. Where if you look at this is 60-40. That's really high. A lot of poinsettias are grown in less perlite, which is, it can be done. I think at the college we use standard 20% perlite. It just requires a lot more careful monitoring of irrigation. And it gives you a little less control over what's happening in the root zone. So root disease can be a bit of an issue. But generally speaking, up to 40% perlite is preferred. Where most crops are happy with 10 to 20%. pH is fairly normal, I would say, maybe slightly on the higher side, because with poinsettias we want to make sure calcium is readily available. As far as general production goes, you start your blackout in for what we call short response cultivars in early September. These are cultivars that are going to flower early, that you're going to sell quickly. For your mid-season to late cultivars, you can start your blackout later in September. You may not even have to black out that much for the rest of the season, but it's still a good idea. There are some crops you can black out in September right early, like Freedom, and they'll give you, if you just did it naturally, it'd be an 8-week response before they start to flower. You can shave a whole week off with blackout. That doesn't sound like much, but a week is a fair amount of time from a business perspective. So once you've rooted and you're growing your crop, the next thing you need to do is pinch it. I mentioned early in this lesson that Matt will have some examples for you to look at. Pinching is basically to break apical dominance, right? A poinsettia in its natural growing habitat becomes a tall, spindly tree, and we want bushy plants. So we have to remove the apical stem to encourage lateral branching. Now that also adds some time to your crop, right? So pinching happens ideally very early in September. That's why it's a bit dicey with you guys being able to do all of it before you get to class. So you'll get to see as the term goes on. Matt usually leaves a few plants that are not pinched so you can see what they look like, and they look goofy, uh, like a red Christmas tree. Maybe you can get a variety that looks good, and maybe you got a new market. I don't know. So anyways, by pinching, we remove the growing tip and usually several leaves. Remove the leaves around the tip mainly to allow light to penetrate to the stem to help those lateral branches to get sugars and grow more quickly. So that's how that works. The hard pinch or the soft pinch, all we do is remove the tip. We don't remove the other leaves. Um, the risk is that there's some residual apical dominance and you might have uneven crops. And it might also take slightly longer for your lateral breaks to form. So hard to say. Hard pinch, I think, with a couple leaves is the better way to go. Where this is always complicated is that with poinsettias, there's lots of different cultivars out there. And companies breed them all the time, and they have been constantly improving poinsettias to make them easier to grow, easier to branch, less labor for pinching, that kind of thing. So definitely you want to read the grower sheet before you get into exactly how you would grow poinsettia. So typically pinching happens around 2 weeks after transplanting, around up to an inch from the top, 1 to 2 large leaves, and then we're good to go. This is just a picture depicting some of this is doing let me switch colors here. So there's a apical pinch, and they're also doing a lateral pinch on the sides to improve. So now with this apical gone, you're going to get lateral growth here, making it bushier, and then you'll get lateral growth off these branches. And you end up with more flowers and a bushier plant. I've got a slide coming later that shows how a lot of commercial farms pinch their poinsettias now. But yeah, so the number of flowers is dictated by the number of internodes. So on that last slide, you would have seen branches, in each one is an internode. So maybe the lowest 1 or 2 nodes don't produce flowers, but after that, each bract will form on a node. So the more nodes you have, the more flowers you get, and the more showy the plant becomes. Now, if it's too many, if you go over the top, the plant becomes really, really wide and resists squeezing into a box for shipping. And then what happens is the branches will snap. So you've got to be careful that you don't overdo how much pinching you do. This is a picture showing poinsettias being packed, and they often have to be dropped into a mylar cone that gathers the plant into a narrow shape so that you can slide it into a cardboard box. And the branches on poinsettia are not very flexible, and if it's too wide and too full, then they snap. And once the branch snaps, it basically breaks off, and you end up with quality reports with your customers. So it's important you don't get too crazy with the branching. On your PowerPoint slides, this YouTube link is active, but on the slide here, you can see a picture of this device. It has a motor and a saw blade that cuts the plant, and then it blows air to knock the cuttings into a basket to catch them. And they just drag this over the crop, and it will hack the top of the plants off. You can see in front of here, these have been cut. So they look like they've been mowed off, and some of the leaves are cut partially. It doesn't matter. You're going to grow way past this for the finished product. So that's how a larger facility can pinch a huge number of pots in a very short time. Relative humidity. This is something obviously we're going to cover in the greenhouse environment course as well, but as you get into cooler seasons like fall growing, those kinds of crops, there's some real challenges with humidity. Air is such that as it cools, it can hold less humidity, which means the moisture in the air is more willing to precipitate and form condensation. Or at the very least, because there's higher humidity, the plant can't transpire as much. And I already mentioned that the bracts don't have stomata. And when you get high humidity, you end up with something called brack edge burn. That's where the edges of the red leaves get white scalded edges because without moisture moving slowly through the leaf, we can't pull calcium to the edge where the cells are growing. So a lot of poinsettia crops require that calcium chloride be sprayed on them for the last few weeks, each week to make sure that they don't get brack edge burn. So they're sort of adding calcium to the external side of the leaf. Um, Let me just quickly review for here. Like Plant Science 1, you would have learned, actually I talked about it in Plant Science 2, the idea that as cells are dividing, they divide and then they start forming a new cell wall by spinning cellulose around them. And then they put lignin in there to solidify it into a cell wall. Now, one of the ways that cell walls can be made more rigid is by the plant putting calcium into that. The calcium kind of is like throwing magnets into there, and they snap the cell wall rigid. So if you don't have enough calcium, the walls are soft, and then they can crack with humidity or split, and then that ends up sort of dying back. It's not necessarily fungal, but it doesn't look very good. Here's a picture showing you what brack edge burn looks like along the edge here. Um, so it's necrosis of the edge. And so by spraying the crop weekly with calcium chloride, we can make sure that enough calcium gets there. Now remember, leaves have stomata, so they're less likely to get that edge burn because they can have moisture evaporating out of the leaf through the stomata, where the bracts don't. And so the bracts end up not able to move calcium to the edge quickly enough because of the high humidity, and then they burn. So that's brack edge burn. Make sure you know how that happens for your quiz in your midterm. So physiological issue, worse under when plants are large. Obviously, the larger the bract, the further the calcium has to be drawn. So poinsettias that have very, very large bracts are more prone to brack edge burn. So they definitely have to be sprayed regularly with calcium chloride. If you're growing too warm, that can happen because the plant can't transpire sufficiently. Uh, Not in the bracts. It can in the leaves, but not the bracts. If you use too much fertilizer, again, rapid causes rapid growth, which leads to calcium not being moved quickly enough to keep up with it. Also, you can get insecticide burn. It's not always calcium. It can be that you've used too much insecticide and you've burnt the edges of the leaves. After someone sprays a crop, the water tends to hang on the edges of the leaves. And then as it dries, the droplets become more and more concentrated, and eventually you can reach a concentration that can damage the tissue. And then, of course, the last one is insufficient calcium in your fertilizer, right? So make sure you have sufficient calcium. A lot of poinsettia fertilizers have extra calcium in them to make up for this. So there's relative humidity. This is an issue with botrytis in this case. That's not brack edge burn. Sometimes that is confused, but it's not that sort of white blonde edge. It's got definite rings of different colors, so you know it's botrytis. So for sure, when growing any crop in the fall, it's important not to be cheap, right? That means that you're going to open your vents and vent the humidity out, and you may even have to use heat to encourage the air to flow out of the greenhouse. Some farmers are cheap and they don't want to open the vents because then they have to turn the heat on. That's not good. You're going to damage your crop. You got to vent. You got to have fresh air flowing through that crop. Spacing poinsettias, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because it gets, there's every crop is a little different, but typically you space according to the size of the plant, right? If it's a very large plant, you want to give them at least a little bit of room between each plant. Otherwise, they become what we call stovepipes. On the left here is the poinsettia that was grown too close to its neighbors, and it's gotten tall and skinny. And the one on the right was grown with proper spacing, and it's got good structure to it. So stovepiping is not desirable. It doesn't look good. Customers don't want that. They want something that's nice and bushy and globe-like. Since this is a long, boring lesson, I'm just going to suggest you may want to take a break here, put a pause on, come back. I know I feel like that squirrel right now, but I'll push through. You can pause me. So we've already talked about how poinsettias are a cool crop, and I want to introduce a concept called diff. A diff is the difference, so that's where the diff comes from, difference between day and night temperature. So if there's a zero diff, that means that your day and night temperatures are identical, right? If there's a negative diff, that means your night temperature is warmer than your day. Um, at the very least, and I'll explain this in other courses as well, but I'll introduce it to you today. Nighttime is when the plant is busy doing things with the sugar that it made during the day. And so if your nighttime is warm, you can burn through more sugar than you did produce during the day. And what that ends up doing is causing the plant to sort of stress out. Um, it also will try to grow, but because it has less sugar, because it's burning through it, it will be able to lay down fewer cells. So you end up with less stretch, so shorter, more compact plants. Um, if you have cooler night temperatures, then you have normal growth. And if you really exaggerate it, then you can have stretch growth. So as far as diff with poinsettias, we aim for a zero diff to finish the crop the last couple of weeks. Um, Often cooling the temperature as it moves towards maturity. Is there an ideal temperature? Same thing. The last few weeks, the last 3 weeks, we grow quite cold. And this because primarily it keeps the bracts size under control and gives you a richer color. Um, the colors become less intense as the bracts are oversized because the pigments are spread out more and diluted. Also, growing under cooler temperatures makes the tissues a bit tougher, so they're less likely to bruise when you're sleeving them. They also stick upright a little bit more. They're not as floppy. And you don't get flower drop, which is unsightly. So if it's too cold, your bracts can become almost green, like they lose their color too much, like they become almost more like a leaf. Not to mention you are running the risk of botrytis from condensation forming on the crops because it's too cold and humid. As far as your daily average temperature, it does impact your time to flowering. So a lot of farms have to monitor their daily average to make sure that they don't miss their ship date. So they may have to raise the temperature to speed things up or cool the temperature to slow things down, depending on where they are with the date they intend to ship. But you can see from 22 to 16 degrees, we can go from 49 days to finishing flowering to 74. That's like 50% increase. That's significant. So warm temperatures, we get more leaves produced, we get bigger leaves and bracts, and they mature more quickly. And in more recent years, a lot of the breeders have actually taken advantage of this and programmed the crops to work well with this to cut back on labor. It means you can finish a quicker, bushier crop with a warmer season. Uh, but they require a little more light, sometimes grow lights during the day in order to do this. As far as fertilizing poinsettias, they are what we call moderate feeders. It's not crazy. Uh, Obviously, the rate that you use depends on how you're fertilizing. Are you watering from the top or are you sub-irrigating? Um, Watering from the top tends to deliver less nutrients, so you can use a slightly higher EC. You may want to make sure you follow with clear water so you don't get salt burn. Where sub-irrigation, which we often do at the college with our aquamats, you tend to deliver a fair amount of nutrient solution to the root zone every time you do it, so you have to use a slightly lower EC. Um, as always, growers should monitor and track the ECs so that they can monitor anything that might be linked to a disease or stress and go back and see what happened. As far as fertilizing, we already talked about this in root zone. The instructions for growing typical poinsettias are 200 ppm of nitrogen, right? Remember, it's about nitrogen. Start the crop at 25-40% ammonium versus nitrate. And towards the end of the crop, we have no ammonium, just nitrate. If you recall that other class, I talked about how ammonium causes rapid soft growth. We don't want that as we're getting near the end of the crop. We want to harden the crop off so it ships better and has longer shelf life. On top of that, calcium, which we know is responsible for bract edge burn, we have to make sure we add that towards the end of the crop, and also molybdate. Again, a lot of poinsettia fertilizers have extra calcium and molybdate in them. And then the last 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to clear water feed them. So I already mentioned this, but ammonium should be reduced towards the end of the crop. And also because it causes rapid growth, it will also exaggerate bract edge burn because we want to slow the growth rate down at that point. pH is important if it gets too low. So often we want lower pH because we're worried about iron availability. But poinsettias are calcium inefficient, which means we got to make sure the pH is not too low because calcium becomes less available as pH gets more acidic. So monitor pH levels, otherwise you could get bract edge burn. So again, plotting EC, pH, and ECs, depending on how you do it, 2-to-1 or pour through, these are what you're looking for, typical values. Not crazy high. So as far as solving problems, again, some repetition here, but it's probably not a bad thing. Excuse me. We want to make sure the plants are transpiring. So not having too much humidity, right? Reduce that. Make sure there's enough calcium in the root zone. We want to have well-drained media so that the roots don't rot. We want to keep our ECs under control so the roots don't rot. We want to make sure we're adding calcium chloride sprays towards the end of the crop to prevent bract edge burn. And then, of course, cultivar selection, that depends on where you live and what your greenhouse. This is something I can't really tell you. You have to figure that out looking at the catalogs to see what works best for your particular greenhouse. Now, obviously, anywhere where you guys might go and work, they would have their established routines and cultivars, so you don't have to figure that out. And then, of course, avoiding pesticides on bracts so you don't get burned. I mean, ideally, we avoid pesticides altogether, right? Use those beneficial bugs. Molybdenum, I alluded to that in a previous slide. If you don't have enough molybdenum in the soil, you get what we call marginal chlorosis, so yellowing on the edges of the leaves. And you can also get edge burn on fairly new leaves. Typically, it has to do with using too much ammonium in the fertilizer, or growing too cold, or having just really bad string of weather. This is what molybdenum deficiencies look like. Controlling height in poinsettias is important. We already talked about pinching, so that prevents apical dominance and stretch, and encourages a nice thick stem so that the plant is sturdy, and also that the bracts can be supported, so everything's strong by keeping it compact. Now we can do that by using hormones as well, and poinsettias are sprayed almost every single stage of the crop with growth regulators. So these are plant hormones that will block cytokinin production for the most part. Psychocell is probably the most common one. It's sprayed even in rooting and then by pinching, and it's sprayed after pinching almost weekly. Last application, the last time you add it, around 2 weeks before your SD, which was ship date. And it's almost always sprayed, not drenched, because that gives you a little more control. And drench can lead to disease. So now, growers typically have a chart that tracks the growth of their poinsettia so they can keep it on target. You'd have a few plants outside in your crop with a stick on them, and you would measure the height of the crop weekly and put it on your plot and see if you're within the acceptable ranges here. So the red lines would be your boundaries for the lowest and the highest heights tolerable. And your goal is to keep the crop somewhere between those for the duration of the crop cycle. So if you're right on target, then you're good. So looking at this crop here, this is the last couple of weeks where you don't spray anymore. And so the crop's going to start to grow again. But because you did your spraying prior to that, you're low enough that you can accept that last growth and you'll be within the growth target for the ship date. Yeah, cycle cell is it's really nice because it's actually forgiving. Some growth regulators, you spray once and they have an impact for the next 6 weeks, and if you get it wrong, you can really mess things up. Where cycle cell, basically the plants quickly grow out of it. It only delays for about a week. So that gives you some forgiveness. Diffing, we talked about that already, right? So lower diff night versus warmer night. So lower night, warmer night, we get different stretch between the internodes. Warmer night keeps it shorter, cooler night keeps them longer. So you can also do that to control your crop without spraying cycle cell. So some farms can do that. It depends on the climate you're growing in, and it depends on the greenhouse and its capabilities. But generally speaking, equal day-night temperature is what we really want. And obviously in early September, that we have quite warm days still. That can be really challenging. Prior to shipping, so we want to improve the quality. I mentioned this earlier. So for the last 2.5 weeks, we reduce humidity substantially. So by heating and venting, to prevent any kind of fungal infection or brack edge burn, because we're at the most susceptible stage for that in the crop. We also lower the temperature, right? That means that plants will not burn through the sugars they've made and store them, which gives you better shelf life. And if you have, some people grow poinsettias in their hanging baskets to make more crop, those are the first ones to ship. So get rid of those ones first. As far as quality, temperature, monitoring your temperature regularly, keeping it as dialed in as possible gives you the best quality. Pinching on time, not too late. Late is almost always a bad thing. Monitoring your ECs and your plant heights to make sure you're on target. Duds do happen because this is a crop that's grown from cuttings, not seed. So there's inherent variability. So if you see duds, get rid of them. Don't waste your space. You're better off giving the space to neighboring plants. But basically, to grow successful poinsettia, you have to do this. This is your life. You're going to live and breathe the crop for 4.5 months. And then you get a little bit of a break over Christmas, and then boom, you're back at it again. But rolling out a quality crop is a rewarding experience. So.